Hello and welcome to the channel, my friends. It's Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to talk about a franchise that is very close to my heart. Resident Evil. This is a series that has basically been there from my earliest gaming days. A series that has grown with me over the years, reinventing itself with each new release and with each new generation. Of all of the game series I have enjoyed over the decades, Resident Evil has the most impressive release cadence, while also maintaining a very high level of quality, with just a few missteps over the years. I've been playing these games at release for nearly 30 years now, but I've come to realize that while I've replayed a few of the games many times, like Resident Evil 4, there are a few that I've not played since that original release date many years ago, and there are at least 2 mainline games that I never actually completed. So my plan is to replay every mainline release in the series, including all of the numbered titles and the remakes. And I'm going to throw in Code Veronica and Revelations 1 and 2, even though it's debatable if those are mainline games. I'm going to play through the games in release order, and then put together a review and retrospective for each game individually. I intend to contrast my memories and feelings playing these games originally, years and decades ago, against how the games hold up today. I'm going to play through these games on the PC where available, and for the older titles with graphical mods to try to play these in the best possible light today. When I'm done with the entire series, I want to do a final video with my overall thoughts on the series and a ranking of all of the games. And a warning here, there will be some spoilers, but let's go ahead and get started. And tonight we'll be discussing Resident Evil 6. This is a game I have both been dreading and excited to check out. I remember being very excited for this game prior to release. At the time, it looked like the game that would right the course of the series after the wrongs of Resident Evil 5. They were trying to appeal to both old and new fans, and it seemed to have a bit of everything. It had multiple campaigns, and brought together nearly the entire cast of the Resident Evil franchise. In previews, it tried to push both the horror of the earlier games, but also the action of the later games. Then they released a demo, and I remember hating this demo with every fiber of my being. I did not care for the combat, the quick-time events, and even Leon's section that was closer to the slower-paced classic games just felt off. Then the reviews dropped, and it was the worst reviewed mainline game in the series, and I decided I was never going to play this game. This is the only mainline game that I've never actually played outside of that pre-release demo. So you can see the trepidation to play this because of the reputation surrounding it, but also my excitement to play the game as it's the only mainline game that I've actually skipped and never played before. I've been told by some fans of this game that if you treat it like a generic action game, unrelated to the Resident Evil series, that I might appreciate it more. So I'm going to come at this from 2 different angles. How does it hold up against the other third-person action games from that time, like Gears of War or Uncharted, in a more generic way? And how well does it represent the Resident Evil series? Well, let's define that real quick. The key components I'm looking for in a Resident Evil game are exploration, horror, and resource management. Exploration for me is the first component. In the best games of this series, you are exploring a unique location, be it a single mansion, the streets of Raccoon City, or a European village. It should start small, but slowly unfold like a puzzle box, revealing different passages, secrets, puzzles, and scares. Next, you need the horror. A lot of this comes from the atmosphere of the location, which is why exploration is so important, but there also needs to be a scary enemy, be it a zombie, a ganado, werewolves, or whatever Capcom comes up with next. You also need to be afraid that they can kill you at any moment, that you're alone and one mistake and you're dead. And the final component is resource management. Each game gives you different tools to defeat the horror, but it's important that they're limited. You never quite have enough, but through careful management of your resources, you can overcome the horror. So let's go ahead and get started now that we've defined that. So today I am playing the PC version of this game, and I gotta say it runs great outside of some issues with ultra-wide support. During the gameplay, ultra-wide works, but there are some UI issues, and also all of the cinematics are all stretched and messed up in ultra-wide, so I'm playing in 16:9, and I've had good success both on the PC and playing it on the Steam Deck. And you gotta say, largely the graphics hold up. There are some moments even where the use of light and shadow effectively hide the lower quality assets, and it nearly looks like a modern release. Now, there are other moments where the lower quality assets, textures in particular, from the Xbox 360 era are much more obvious, and it looks worse even in some moments than Resident Evil 5, in my opinion. Overall, the art direction's pretty good here and stays consistent throughout, and there are just a huge number of enemies and locations that are all really well realized. Overall, the graphics largely hold up and are not the thing that holds back this game. So next up, let's talk about the structure of the game. Now, I usually will go pretty in depth in this section, going over major story points and locations, and honestly, it would just be describing explosions for 10 minutes. So instead, we are going to talk in very broad terms about the structure of the game and the story. And this game is broken up into 4 lengthy campaigns that all occur simultaneously across the globe. The 4 chapters are from Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Jake Mueller, and Ada Wong's perspective, and each chapter is pretty different. While they all control identically, the type of enemies, the locations, and the tone of each chapter feels pretty different. You go through these campaigns in any order, but I decided to go in the order that they were presented, which I believe is the intended order, though they're not in chronological order, and there is a ton of overlap in these chapters. Sometimes you experience a particular set piece from multiple perspectives, but it may be hours later because of how the game is structured. Now, the game starts out with Leon and Helena's campaign, which feels like it's trying most to emulate the classic Resident Evil experience, with the more traditional zombie enemy, but your character control is the same across all the campaigns, and it lacks any real scares or atmosphere because you're such a badass right from the start. And after that is the Chris Redfield and Piers Niven's campaign. This feels like it's trying to push into the action side of the Resident Evil spectrum. The campaign is a cross between a bad Call of Duty game full of Biohazards and Gears of War. Much of the campaign has you accompanied by a full team of BSAA agents. Nearly every enemy in the campaign has a firearm of some variety, and much of the campaign is full-on cover-based shooting that just doesn't feel great. After that, you play through the Sherry Birkin and Jake Mueller campaign, and that campaign is pretty action-packed, like Chris's, except you're also relentlessly chased by a tyrant-like boss named the Ustanok. There are a few sections here that are more open and give you some limited exploration, like the second chapter in the snow, but a lack of functioning map makes it pretty frustrating. And the last chapter is Ada Wong's campaign, which is a bit more stealth and puzzle focused. There are more and longer sections where she has no enemies and she's just exploring and puzzle solving. Her campaign primarily has her in the background of the other campaign, helping out from the shadows and intersecting with many of the other chapters, bouncing from location to location using her grappling hook while trying to track down her doppelganger. It feels a bit like her campaign from Resident Evil 4, showing what she was doing between her encounters with Leon. And in these 4 campaigns, you cover just a huge amount of ground, including Adonia, a fictional Eastern European country, an American school campus, an underground train tunnel, apocalyptic city centers, a graveyard, a crypt, abandoned labs, a plane headed for China, underwater bases, submarines, and a large section of an infected Chinese city, just to name a few. And the story is told in a very non-linear manner, out of order if you go through the campaigns as they're presented. So let's spend 2 minutes just talking about what happens in this game in chronological order. And this section will have many story spoilers, so be warned. So the game starts out with Jake Mueller, who we learn is the estranged son of Wesker, who is a mercenary working for Neo Umbrella in Adonia. Jake and the other mercenaries have just been given an injection of the C virus, and all the other mercenaries transform into bioweapons known as Javos. Sherry Birkin shows up and claims they need his blood to make a cure, and they flee together. They're hunted by a creature known as the Ustanok that looks like a WWE wrestler. At the same time, Chris Redfield and Piers Niven and a team of BSAA agents are responding to the attack in Adonia. They run into Jake and Sherry and help them escape on a helicopter. And Chris and his team are attacked by Ada Wong, but you later find out it's not the real Ada. She kills his entire team except for Chris and Piers, and after escaping, Jake and Sherry are also eventually captured by Neo Umbrella after an encounter with Ustinov. 6 months later, the President of the United States is about to disclose the truth behind the Raccoon City incident when a biohazard attack occurs at the venue, and he and everyone else except for Leon Kennedy and a Secret Service agent named Helena Harper are zombified. The pair escape and later encounter the real Ada Wong, and it turns out that Helena helped initiate the attack because the real big baddie, Simmons, the national security chief, had captured her sister. That sister becomes a monster. A real sexy monster that you have to put down. Sometime in here, Jake and Sherry escape from Neo Umbrella again. Leon and Helena fake their own deaths and travel to China to stop Simmons. Along the way, they run into an escaped Sherry and Jake. The Chinese city of Lanxing is largely infected and is the backdrop for much of this section. During this time, Chris is in a depression after his men were killed by Ada and sort of has amnesia and is currently an alcoholic, but Piers snaps him out of it and they rush to China to help. Chris seems more concerned with revenge on Ada and has a confrontation with Leon after they capture her, but she escapes. Jake and Sherry are also captured again and taken to an underwater facility. Chris and Piers assault an oil platform above that secret underwater facility. They eventually free Sherry and Jake and have a fight with a giant bioweapon named Heos. In 3 different final showdowns, our heroes each manage to take down a final boss. So severely injured Piers infects himself with the C virus to help take down Heos, and helps Chris escape, but stays behind to die. Jake and Sherry finally manage to kill Ustinov after countless chase scenes, and Ada kills her doppelganger and then helps Leon and Helena confront and kill a mutated Simmons. Everyone gets a happy ending, well, except for Piers, he died. In the end, Leon and Helena are cleared of the president's death and return to duty. Chris remains with the BSAA in command of a new squad after overcoming his guilt. And Jake begins a new life fighting bioweapons with his identity concealed. And Ada gets a call for a new mysterious job. So this is actually one of the more coherent stories in the series, and I don't hate it. It manages to juggle a bunch of characters, and I like the pairings, and generally like the new characters and the depth added to the existing characters. The voice acting and presentation are also top-notch. The story is told in a non-linear and somewhat confusing fashion, but the way it drip feeds you the details feels pretty cinematic, and it's really amazing how they connect all these stories together in the end. The issue is how bombastic and ridiculous it seems at times. It's as if the entire story was told by Michael Bay, with an explosion every 30 seconds, and very little time for real self-reflection. So let's move on to the gameplay, which feels pretty similar to Resident Evil 4 and 5, except it's way more complex and fast-paced. Initially, I really hated the combat, but over time it grew on me. You can move and shoot at the same time, which worked in Revelations because of the max movement speed being pretty slow, but here you're just constantly sprinting across the battlefield, shooting and punching dudes. You also get so many dodge moves, melee attacks, rolls, prone options. They're all functional, but feel a bit out of place in this series. You have a ton of melee options and can quickfire against nearby enemies. At first it feels pretty sloppy and imprecise, and you're constantly fighting against the camera, but it did eventually click for me, and the mix of melee combat and gunplay was fun, almost leaning into a character action game like Devil May Cry. But again, it just doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game, and don't get me started on the cover shooter sections and how bad that feels. This game is focused on action more than anything, at the expense of all horror and tension. You'll have a cutscene full of explosions that cuts into gameplay for 10 seconds, followed by another lengthy cutscene full of explosions. There are car chases, turret sequences, motorcycle and snowmobile sections. There's literally a part where you fly around in a fighter jet, and one of the main final battles is primarily fought from a fighter helicopter. It's the Fast and the Furious of the Resident Evil series, and not in a good way. And the game basically has two speeds. Either you're walking slowly listening to exposition, or you're running for your life from set piece to set piece. The game never gives itself any time to breathe or allow you to explore and discover a location. And some of these locations, like the college campus, have some really cool elements, but they only last a few minutes before you move on to the next explosion. In any previous game, you would have spent 6 hours at the campus exploring it room by room, finding secrets in new passageways, rescuing people, learning the history of the place. In this game, you literally run through it in about 10 minutes. There's also way too many QuickTime events. Nearly every action in the game is dragged out into multiple button presses. The button presses are not consistent, so you always need to pay attention to the intrusive prompts that fill the screen and make obnoxious sounds. There are multiple QuickTime events that will result in instant death, including one about 30 seconds into the game. I nearly quit playing after the first few chapters because the QTEs were totally taking me out of the game until I found a setting in the options to disable most of them. I really want to know who thought it was a good idea to have this many cutscenes filled with QuickTime events. They don't add tension, it's just annoying. Beyond the QuickTime events, there are also many moments where it will load you in a chase scene or an escape scene from a cinematic, and it's super disorienting, and you need to do a very specific series of actions, but it gives you no heads up as to what you're supposed to be doing. The entire time, everything on the screen is exploding, the camera is shifting around, showing you who knows what in the foreground, and the entire screen is shaking like the cameraman has Parkinson's. You end up dying over and over until you figure out what the stupid game wants you to do. It's not fun, it's not scary, it's just frustrating. There is an incredible amount of enemy variety, I gotta say. There's zombies and there's Javos, making up the majority, but the Javos come in like a dozen varieties. After you kill them, they'll come back with like huge arms or legs or flying or bat-like things or crawling like spiders. Unfortunately, first you have to kill them as generic gun-wielding enemies, then you kill them a second time. It makes each encounter feel like they're twice as long. There's also a good number of boss enemies, but too many of them end up being QTE fests without much real strategy. And the game's a bit of a conundrum. So the combat has been made more complex, but each system around it has been simplified. There's no real player agency or choice in how you approach the game. You can now carry every weapon at once. There's no real inventory management. You can't upgrade your weapons. Resource management is basically non-existent. There's zero exploration. You're just constantly running to this intrusive marker on the screen. The game gives you almost no choice, and it's really just a turn off your brain kind of game. And there's a ton of little gameplay things that irritate me. You know, like the way the camera shifts down when you sprint. The way the camera is far too zoomed in. The way the camera will focus on some story element, taking control away from you, even in the middle of a battle. Melee attacks don't lock on enemies and have a really short range. You know, having to prepare healing items and the healing system in general. The inventory system or lack of one. The way they got rid of the weapon upgrades. The constant QTE event. The enemies that can leap at you from across the level. The readability of enemies and bosses is terrible, and I never know if I'm attacking the right weak point or just wasting ammo. The co-op partner that's constantly either on top of you blocking your view or 10 miles away when you're waiting for them at a level transition. It's just one frustrating system after another, and it makes the whole thing kind of come down a level. And it's kind of sad because the gunplay itself is pretty decent, but it's everything it's wrapped up in. The QTEs, the cinematics, the chase scenes, the over-the-top explosions. Like, if they just leaned more into the gameplay, and then they advanced the systems more, like weapon upgrades, more choices, a working map system, exploration, I think this game could have been so much better. So final thoughts. This game failed for me in almost every respect. And it's not like Capcom didn't try here. This game is really ambitious. They've probably spent more money and development time than most games in the series. You know, there are 4 full campaigns with a ton of unique content, each with custom UI elements, enemies, cinematics, gameplay. It's just that the game has a serious case of schizophrenia. It tried to appeal to everyone, and ended up appealing to almost no one. Each campaign tried to appease a different group, but when you add it together, it doesn't equal a coherent game. There are brief moments that work, a fun set piece here, or a killer enemy design, but then there are 20 more ideas that just don't work out. I think this is a perfect example of more is not always better, and quality over quantity. I would prefer a well-paced 8-hour game over this 20-hour mess. As I said, I wanted to come at this from both a Resident Evil perspective and as a generic action game. I have to say it fails in both respects. This is the Resident Evil game that most veered away from its roots. It abandons all pretense of survival horror for action and explosions. There's no resource management, there's zero exploration, and as a generic action game, it mostly works, but I would still consider it pretty middling. The actual gameplay sections are fine, but they're constantly broken up by annoying QTE, instant death chase scenes, and the cover shooting sections are just bad and drag on for much of the game. And when I died, I rarely felt like I did something wrong, or rather, I didn't follow the very narrow gameplay path that the developers wanted me to follow. So in the end, I'm not saying this is the worst game ever. It's not broken like Superman 64 or something, but for me, it's the worst Resident Evil game, and just a mediocre action game that falls short of contemporary releases. You might find some fun here playing in co-op if you can overlook the shortcoming, but if you're looking for a real Resident Evil experience, I would avoid this game at all costs. So I'm going to end the video there. I do appreciate everyone who has watched. Please drop me a comment with any thoughts, like and subscribe, and keep out for my next episode, which will probably be in the next couple of weeks. Thanks again.